Hello. I was just in the middle of reading, and I got a message saying, "Your work has just begun. Kindly smack down some more insufferable demagogues." Thank you. The trouble is, currently I am at university, but this is like the 24-hour period or so where I don't really have to do much. I mean, I could do much to get ahead, but I don't need to. The trouble is that I've got people sleeping from all angles, so I have to talk quite quietly. I know, and the last video, a lot of people were saying that they couldn't really hear me because I was talking quite quietly, and then some guy said they didn't like how close my face was to the camera. I might have to move my face closer to the camera. I don't know how much closer I can get. No, it's terrible. Okay. And I don't want to make this a thing, actually, because, like I said, I don't have that much free time, but I do have notes, and particularly regarding one insufferable demagogue known as Sam Harris. So, yeah, I'm not going to go through everything he did. I've read The Moral Landscape. One of the annoying things about, like, YouTube is that I tend to read books and like just kind of quietly grumble to myself about how I disagree with them, and I don't think it's really possible to do reviews of books. I mean, I know Steve Shives reviews books, but he's kind of, I don't know, I mean, it's his job. I feel like just for a casual thing, you can't really review books, so I'm going to just do a video response to the Sam Harris vs. William Lane Craig debate, particularly because I've uploaded several videos onto my channel over the years. I tend to just delete them after a while, just because I think I disassociate myself from them. But one of the videos that I did upload, or two of the videos I uploaded were one criticising Sam Harris, and the other one posting William Lane Craig's closing statement for that debate. I think William Lane Craig absolutely destroyed it. And at the end of this video, what I will do is post at the end of William Lane Craig's closing statement. He lists the arguments that were not addressed, and I will basically just do a montage where he lists the arguments, and it will show him making the arguments. And you know, I'm not going to show everything Sam Harris said, but I promise you, every single argument that he did not address, he absolutely 100% ignored it. He didn't even say he wasn't going to address it. There was a point in particular where he actually referred to the argument. It's a bit where he says William Lane Craig makes a good argument about psychopaths and how psychopaths relate to Sam Harris's idea about the moral landscape. And Sam Harris says, "Oh, I'm glad William Lane Craig brought up the idea of psychopaths, because this view that Christianity offers is psychopathic." So he literally acknowledges the argument, but he doesn't address it, he just uses it to talk about how he disagrees with Christianity, and that is basically what happened. I think it's very obvious, and this is why I disagree with Sam Harris, as not on an intellectual level. I do disagree with him on an intellectual level, but he uses, as much as like his kind of anti-Islam remarks and his moral realist remarks are generally disregarded and disliked, what I find more objectionable is the fact that he's clearly using it to springboard his position to be a notable atheist. Because being an atheist is boring, but being an atheist who talks about how other liberals are stupid and should hate Islam more, and how other moral relativists are stupid and they should hate Islam more, he relates everything to Islam. That's what he does, and that's kind of how he gets out there, and what you will see if you watch this debate in full. And you should watch this debate in full, because it is brilliantly bad. You'll see Sam Harris ignoring the entire discussion and just kind of talking about how much he dislikes Christianity and how he finds the ideas of Christianity to be stupid As you know, it would be fine if the debate were on whether or not Christianity is true. I'm not a Christian. I'm agnostic, apatheist, but I do find kind of the debate surrounding the whole issue quite interesting. So particularly debates like this are what I find really interesting about how atheism and theism play off each other. I can't really say that I support Sam Harris much, or Dawkins, or Hitchens, but I do, I guess, engage with them in the same way I engage with Stefan Molyneux and the YouTube atheists, who are becoming more and more obscure, as are the new atheists. But I've rambled for a bit, so I'm just going to play the Sam Harris clips that I'm interested in responding to for now.
That once we understand morality in terms of human well-being, we'll be able to make strong claims about which behaviors and ways of life are good for us and which aren't.
Hello, you might notice that I've changed my top since the last kind of scene of this video. It's because I am not very good at sticking to responding, especially when there's like a lot of stuff I have to respond to. You know, this is actually right off the back of my Stefan Molyneux video, which I'm probably going to upload immediately before this one. So that should make sense, I guess, to people who watch these in chronological order, if you do. So I'm trying to work out in what sense he uses the term strong claims. It's not a philosophical term, that much is certain. I mean, it's either not a philosophical term, it's a very obscure philosophical term. But the analogy I can think of is when people talk about strong atheism being a position that we can claim that God does not exist. And in that sense it seems like he's implying that without moral objectivity, you cannot make strong claims about morality. You can, for all intents and purposes, I can claim with just as much fervour that it is wrong to shoot someone in the head for no reason, as Sam Harris can claim that it is wrong to deny evolution. There is no reason why I could not. You know, if you want an example of the fervour of that can emerge from subjectivity, simply look at the comments on a Justin Bieber video. See how much people can make strong claims about entirely subjective matters. Go to a really shitty restaurant and look at the reviews, or look at a really shitty film. You know, go onto IMDb, type in Baby Geniuses, I think it's 2, that's one of the worst films ever. Look at the reviews and tell me that people cannot make strong claims based on subjectivity. People can make very strong claims based on their personal convictions that certain things are immoral. So I'm not sure why you would need to understand morality in the objective sense that Sam Harris understands it in order to make these claims.
And I cited as an example the sadism and misogyny of the Taliban as an example of a worldview that was less than perfectly conducive to human flourishing. And it turns out that to denigrate the Taliban at a scientific meeting is to court controversy.
Well, yes, in the same way that it would be a bit weird to, you know, if you were giving a scientific lecture on recent advancements in the projection that you can get from like a new projector at cinema, and then to say, so now that piece of shit Frozen will look so much better. You know, you'll be caught in controversy because you're bringing in an entirely unscientific opinion into a scientific debate. But even then, that doesn't quite explain it. You must realise that what you are saying is a very contentious issue, and I should note that moral realism is not contentious. there are a lot of philosophers, in fact, possibly the majority of philosophers are actually moral realists, and so it's not like that's the controversy in and of itself, it's that you attempt to ground your moral realism entirely in scientific analysis of the human condition, and that is an incredibly controversial view, because it runs into a lot of the criticisms that you have faced, and criticisms that I won't bring up now because I'm just responding to you talking, but it's not shocking that you got this response from talking about moral realism in this strictly scientific, neuroanalytical manner.
And after my remarks, I fell into debate with another invited speaker, and this is more or less exactly how our conversation went. She said, "How could you ever say that forcing women to wear burqas is wrong from the point of view of science?" I said, well, because I think it's pretty clear that right and wrong relate to human well-being, and it's just as clear that forcing half the population to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them when they try to get out is not a way of maximizing human well-being.
So I'm not going to go into the contentiousness of the subject surrounding human well-being, because I do believe Sam Harris has some quite good rebuttals to those points in particular. Even then, I haven't entirely understood how we can truly say what human well-being is. I do agree with Sam Harris regarding his presumption that the worst possible misery for everyone is a good example of something that really lacks human well-being. But just because we know that fact, it doesn't then follow that we can really say what it is that makes human well-being worse or better. And I need to clarify a point there about his thought experiment, which he does bring up later on, but I'm actually just going to say a few other points when he brings it up. He talks about the worst possible misery for everyone, and that's kind of his benchmark. The trouble is he talks about the worst possible misery for everyone, and it's the word for that I'm taking issue with, in case you couldn't tell by the way I put such a stress on it. For inherently has a very kind of personal and subjective view attached to it, because it's saying that what may be greater suffering for me might not be greater suffering for someone else. It's the worst suffering for everyone. So when you actually kind of move away from that and you move towards sort of the worst suffering for some and not the worst suffering for others, and which person's having more suffering, that is, he acts as if because we know that the worst possible suffering for everyone is bad and the best possible suffering for everyone is good, that automatically means that we can tell every single step in between. We can't, because for everyone implies that what may be good for me may not be good for others, what may be bad for me may not be bad for others, and therefore we cannot immediately make analytical conclusions simply from understanding morality in terms of well-being.
And she said, well, that's just your opinion.
When she says it's just his opinion, she's referring to his statement that he thinks it's pretty clear that human morality relates to right and wrong. That isn't necessarily grounded 100% in science. I mean, it's equivalent to me saying I think it's really clear that good music relates to heavy bass lines. I can say that, and I can preface it with the phrase, it's pretty clear, but that doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean that someone who disagrees with me is automatically wrong.
And I said, okay, well, let's make it even easier. Let's say we found a culture that was literally removing the eyeballs of every third child.
So this is what I call like a quick done point, which is basically a point where you can just point out the obvious flaw. And in this case, it's the fact that if the premise is that morality relating to human well-being is not a scientifically factual statement, then just exacerbating the horrendousness of the act doesn't automatically prove your point. It's, again, like me saying, I think bass lines make better music, and someone walks up to me and says they disagree with me. And I say, well, let's make it even easier. Imagine there was a song with no bass line at all, like a Bob Dylan song. Would you then agree that we had found a song that wasn't perfectly conducive to good music?
Okay, at birth. Would you then agree that we had found a culture that was not perfectly maximizing human well-being?
So this is rather curious because he says perfectly maximizing human well-being, and he's basically talking about two completely different concepts. On the one hand, he has the objective, neurologically grounded understanding of human well-being, which he talks about a lot, and on the other hand, he has the meta-ethical position that human well-being is the thing we should be working to achieve. These are two completely different concepts, and he asks the person, would you agree that this culture is not conducive to human well-being? And the answer there is yes, because generally I think it's not necessarily contentious to say that we can define well-being as including things like pain and things like that. So if you're removing eyeballs from children and it's not conducive to human well-being, that still doesn't get us any closer to proving the meta-ethical contention that human well-being relates to what we ought to be seeking to achieve as a society, or what is objectively valuable to the universe and objective matters.
And she said it would depend on why they were doing it. So after my eyebrows returned from the back of my head.
So he didn't really explain what she meant by this. The first couple of times I watched this, actually, I was very confused by what she meant by this, because it seems like this isn't a question a moral relativist would really ask, because, it's not really relevant. Because of the nature of moral relativism, you don't need to know why someone would do something in order to establish that it's not objectively wrong, because objective wrong is just inherent. The reason why she asked this, and I've come to realize this now, is because obviously moral relativism immediately becomes objective the second you, or objective like, the second you add in a additional conditional. So if you say, so two moral relativists are having a conversation, they both agree they're moral relativists, and then they both agree that democracy is generally a good idea. And one of them says, do you think that we should be supporting pro-democracy campaigns in, Egypt? And then the second one says no, and then the other one said, well, then that doesn't really make any sense, because you claim to be supporting democracy, and yet, maybe if we supported it in the right way, it would bring about democracy. And at this point, they're having a debate, and they're having it based on objective matters. And the reason they're having it based on objective matters is because they've both agreed that democracy is a good thing. And the second you agree that democracy is a good thing, you then have a conversation about how you can bring about democracy. The trouble with Sam Harris's argument is that he's presuming that human well-being is a good thing. But what if you do not agree? What if you say, well, human well-being might be a good thing, but I kind of want to chop off this person's head. I kind of want to torture this person. I kind of want to do all these horrible things. So that's the trouble. Moral relativism ultimately rests on that question. It depends on why they're doing it. If you're removing the eyeballs of your third child, which I believe is what he says, and you value the ability of children to see, then obviously you are being objectively wrong, because you admit that children being able to see is a good thing, and yet at the same time you admit that your actions directly contradict those values, and that is an objective falsehood. And that's basically what it means. So don't think that don't buy into Sam Harris's incredulity about how ridiculous it is that she asks this question, because it's actually quite a sensible question to be asked between a moral relativist and a moral realist.
I said, okay, well, let's say they're doing it for religious reasons. Let's say they have a scripture which says every third should walk in darkness, or some such nonsense. And then she said, well, then you could never say that they were wrong.
So yeah, the reason why religion doesn't provide foundation for an objective moral realist to criticize a moral system is because if it relates to religion, then it relates to divine command theory, and divine command theory supersedes ideas about democracy and things like that. So you cannot necessarily argue with a divine command theorist. The only way you can really argue with a divine command theorist is by saying, by having a theological discussion. So in essence, what this woman is saying is false in one sense, and the reason why is false in one sense is because if you imagine a discussion between two Christians, one Christian believes that that it is absolutely justified to skin babies alive, and the other Christian believes that you should generally, try and turn the other cheek and be moral. Now, the Christian who believes you should generally try to be, moral and turn the other cheek could have a very interesting discussion with the Christian who believes you could skin babies alive, because they both agree in this same divine command theory, which is based on the God of the Bible, and therefore they can have a massive theological discussion. You can say that religious people are wrong, and if anything, it's easier to say religious people are wrong, because you just have to have that theological discussion. And yeah, they might disagree with your interpretation, but theological accuracy is actually a matter of objective reality. If what the Bible says is objective, even if everyone in the world disagreed with what certain parts of the Bible say, they would still say those things.
Okay, and so you should know, I was talking to someone who has a deep background in science and philosophy. She's actually since been appointed to the President's Council on Bioethics. She's one of 13 people advising President Obama on all of the ethical implications of advances in medicine and related science and technology. And she had just delivered a perfectly lucid lecture on the moral implications of neuroscience for the courts. And she was especially concerned that we could be subjecting captured terrorists to lie detection neuroimaging technology. And she viewed this as really an unconscionable violation of cognitive liberty. So on the one hand, her moral scruples were very finely calibrated to recoil from the slightest perceived misstep in ethical terms in our war on terror.
Did it ever occur to you that if you're talking to someone who clearly has a lot of ethics, that it might be that you are wrong in suggesting that moral relativists cannot have a firm foundation in normative ethics? As opposed to suggesting that she's just confused or something. Because I've read a lot on ethics, and I'm a moral relativist. It doesn't follow that I'm some kind of weird contradiction. It's just because the ethical opinions I've developed from all of my reading into ethics still remain that. They still remain my opinions on the matter.
And yet she was quite willing to forgive some primitive culture its fondness for removing the eyeballs of children in its religious rituals.
This statement is actually the whole reason I wanted to make this video. He says that she is willing to forgive this culture. Now, this is just simply false. Saying that a society isn't objectively immoral is not the same as forgiving someone, okay? See, I don't think that there is a metaphysical, scientific concept that says that ISIS is wrong. I don't think that reality exists, that there is a reality above human experience which suggests that what ISIS is doing is wrong. And yet, I'm not forgiven ISIS what they've done for all the hundreds of thousands of innocent Muslims they've killed. And I'm sure that a lot of them will probably die in the war to stop them doing those things. Now, I'm not going to say that I don't forgive them, because I think that generally it's good to try and forgive people, but I certainly hold them in lower esteem than I hold people who do share my ethical values. I hold them in lower esteem than I hold Sam Harris. It's ridiculous to suggest that just because you say, well, science doesn't say they're wrong, which is, like what a lot of sensible people believe, and it's also what a lot of moral realists believe. Just because you say that, it doesn't mean that you've forgiven them. There is more to reality than simply, oh, science doesn't say they're wrong, therefore I forgive them. Science is not the be-all and end-all of the human experience.
And she seemed to me quite terrifyingly detached from the very real suffering of millions of women in Afghanistan at this moment.
How was she detached? I don't know this woman, but she was having a meta-ethical debate, okay? And I have to clarify a point, because this has happened to me a lot. Whenever you have a meta-ethical debate with a moral relativist, and if you're me, then you probably don't very often have meta-ethical debates with moral relativists, but if you ever had to debate as a moral relativist, then you will often find yourself sounding a bit like a psychopath. You'll find yourself kind of saying things that aren't necessarily in line with your normative ethics. You have to say things, like, if you want people to understand moral relativism, you do have to say the sentence, objectively speaking, Hitler did nothing wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that you are detached from the reality of what Hitler did, and what Hitler did was horrible. And it's more horrible than a lot of people on the internet even seem to realise. I'm not one of those Hitler apologists who says things like, oh, Hitler was good for the economy or anything like that. Hitler was just really bad. I'm not detached from that reality just because I say that science has nothing to say on that reality. The scientific consensus on Hitler is that Hitler was an organism who evolved, and he used vibrations from his voice to convince other organisms who evolved that this particular type of organism who evolved on a different part of the planet were these horrible people who deserve to be exterminated by cyclone B gas. And, the train was whatever the dimension of the train were. That is the scientific opinion on the Holocaust. The scientific opinion on the Holocaust is not the Holocaust was a bad thing. And that cannot be the scientific opinion in my humble submission. I do not think that science can ever say that the Holocaust was a bad thing. All science can tell us is what the Holocaust was, how the Holocaust happened. It can tell us every intricate detail about the is of the Holocaust, but it cannot tell us that the Holocaust ought not to have happened. And that is certainly a contention I've never seen Sam Harris debate or refute in any way.
So I see this double standard as a problem.
What double standard? I assume he's referring to, the double standard he's referring to here is that people care about morality, people don't think science has anything to say on morality, or people don't think that objective reality has anything to say on morality. This is not a double standard. In the basic sense, I mean, a double standard is when you kind of hold a hypocritical view. It is not hypocritical for me to say, on the one hand, I really personally oppose the subjugation of women by the Taliban, and on the other hand to say, I really academically oppose the contention that the actions of the Taliban are in contradiction to some objective physical law.
Now, it's widely believed that there are two quantities in this universe. There are facts on the one hand, and of course science can give us our most rigorous discussion of these.
I have to point out that there are facts that go beyond the realms of science, particularly in philosophy and history, and I don't really, I'm just going to disagree with that quietly, just because I think it's a bit of a, it highlights Sam Harris's science centrism, particularly when he says things like, if you don't think science can solve an ethical problem, it's a double standard. this obsession he has that if you do not relate every problem, every value you hold, everything you regard as important to science, then it's suddenly a double standard. That shows that he is just a science sycophant, if you will.
But then there are values, which many people, like Dr. Craig, think science can't touch.
It's kind of contentious to say that there is a fact-value dichotomy, and I will link to the essay title I just quoted there, The Fact-Value Dichotomy by Hilary Putnam. There are a lot more nuances to facts and values that moral relativists appreciate. It's a bit misleading to imply that. I think generally when you try and frame the other person's view in terms of a dichotomy, you are probably misrepresenting their view, especially in philosophy. So don't take this statement as gospel truth.
Now let's start with consciousness. This is not an arbitrary starting point. Imagine a universe devoid of the possibility of consciousness. Imagine a universe entirely constituted of rocks. Okay, there's clearly no happiness or suffering in this universe. There's no good or evil. Value judgments don't apply. For changes in the universe to matter, they have to matter, at least potentially, to some conscious system.
So I've actually brought up this concept before, and it's like a big argument for moral relativism. It's basically the idea that in order for values to matter, I mean what he says basically, in order for values to matter, they have to matter to conscious beings. Now this means that essentially the second that values have any kind of reality to them at all, they immediately become subject to the will of the conscious beings that they have any kind of effect on. So there is no morality in a world full of rocks, but there is morality in a world full of humans. Why? Because humans establish that morality, and therefore I do not see how this can be anything other than an argument for the intricate connection between morality and human assessment on what we ought to value.
Okay, what about well-being? Well, the well-being of conscious creatures and the link between that and morality may seem open to doubt, but it shouldn't. Okay, here's the only assumption you have to make.
I will say that this involves a massive amount of epistemological inquiry, but the upshot of it is that it is also possible that we do not need to make any assumptions, and if we do not need to make any assumptions, then we simply grant that moral relativism is reality. Sam Harris proposes moral objectivity, and he proposes this based on the idea that you accept as a unproven assumption what he is about to propose, and he rejects moral relativism, which is that there is no unproven assumption necessary. You need only grant the reality that morals do not seem to affect the universe, that the universe seems to be neutral. And this, I would argue, is the more rational and academic contention.
Imagine a universe in which every conscious creature suffers as much as it possibly can for as long as it can. Okay, I call this the worst possible misery for everyone. Okay, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. Okay, if the word bad applies anywhere, it applies here. Now, if you think the worst possible misery for everyone isn't bad, or maybe it has a silver lining, or maybe there's something worse, I don't know what you're talking about.
It's not necessarily that the worst possible misery for everyone has a silver lining. It's more that it has a grey lining. It's more that it's grey. It's more that nothing about the whole thing matters. It's more that the rock is not affected by the worst possible misery for everyone in the same way it's affected by quantum mechanics or physics or anything like that. the mouse who never thinks is affected by all matters of science, except for this one matter of science that Sam Harris proposes concerns the worst possible misery for human beings. You know, because human beings are really the only, they have, as he concedes in a TED Talks of his, human beings really feel the pinnacle of the potential for suffering and well-being. So the idea that human suffering is bad, you don't need to talk about silver linings or anything like that. You just need to point out that to whom is it bad? It's bad for us. It's bad to us. And it's not bad to the universe. The universe would carry on if 28 days later, or the day after tomorrow, or 2012 happened tomorrow. What would it mean for science? What would it mean for truth? What would it mean for the universe? What would it mean for the rocks? It would mean nothing. They would carry on. No scientific law, no objective law is violated by the suffering that would be brought about by a great human travesty.
What I'm saying is the minimum standard of moral goodness is to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. If we should do anything in this universe, if we ought to do anything, if we have a moral duty to do anything, it's to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone.
Craig points this out, but I'll just point it out myself. If we should do anything, Sam Harris has not demonstrated that we should do anything. And even if you were to demonstrate that we should do some things, like maybe we should eat or something like that, he would, and I'm not sure how he would demonstrate that necessarily as a moral imperative, he would then be contradicting his idea that we should, at the baseline, at the base level, avoid the worst possible suffering for everyone. Why is it that I should avoid that? You know, why is it that my suffering should matter to me on a moral level? Is it not possible on some level that that my suffering wouldn't matter to me? Or certainly it is possible that other people's suffering wouldn't matter to me, and it is more possible that the suffering of every person wouldn't matter to the universe, which is a point I will continue to raise. And I realise, by the way, that people who really kind of are interested in moral realism and moral relativism are probably thinking I'm being a bit kind of shitty because I'm basically just going for the baseline defense of moral relativism. I'm not really engaging with anything more complicated. And the reality is that I'm not engaging with anything more complicated. I'm engaging with Sam Harris. If I were to engage with actual interesting moral realist critiques, then I would obviously bring out better arguments. But for Sam Harris and the people who accept Sam Harris's ideas, you know, I'm just going to refute Sam Harris's ideas, because all I'm doing right now, all my life is dedicated to, is responding to these really bad arguments made by people. So until I start actually making long, detailed, planned out, scripted videos, I'm just going to keep it at this level. So sorry to all the moral realists who actually have considered their position, and all the moral relativists who've considered their position. I'm not implying that this is the basics of the argument. I'm not implying this is the extent of the argument. Of course it's not.
So here's my argument for moral truth in the context of science. Questions of right and wrong and good and evil depend upon minds. Okay? They depend upon the possibility of experience. Minds are natural phenomena. They depend upon the laws of nature in some way. Okay? Morality and human values, therefore, can be understood through science, because in talking about these things, we are talking about all of the facts that influence the well-being of conscious creatures. In our case, we're talking about genetics and neurobiology and psychology and sociology and economics.
So I said in a previous video that there are 5 ways of understanding morality, and I have to now add a 6th way of understanding morality, which is the study of morality, the sociological, analytical study of morality, which we might call analytical ethics. And that's true, yeah, we can study what human beings value, we can study what human beings regard as moral. We cannot study what matters to the universe, we cannot study what matters to anything outside of humanity. So Sam Harris's idea that we can ground morality in science because of neuroscience and because of the way that humans conceive of morality is vacuous, and it has no real academic or philosophical value. And I think with that I will leave you with William Lane Craig summarising exactly how much Sam Harris failed to address the arguments from his divine command theory arguments. I assume Craig is a divine command theorist, he doesn't. Yeah, I think he is, yeah. I'm not sure, he might just be giving a weird account that's not quite... Anyway, yeah, enjoy.
Secondly, I argued, if God does not exist, we have no foundation for objective moral values or objective moral duties. I showed that on his view, it is logically impossible to say that the moral landscape is identical to the landscape of the flourishing of conscious beings, and that therefore his view is incoherent. Now, what's interesting about this is that earlier in the book, Dr. Harris explained that about 3 million Americans are psychopathic. That is to say, they don't care about the mental states of others. They enjoy inflicting pain on other people. But that implies that there's a possible world which we can conceive in which the continuum of human well-being is not a moral landscape. The peaks of well-being could be occupied by evil people. But that entails that in the actual world, the continuum of well-being and the moral landscape are not identical either. For identity is a necessary relation. There is no possible world in which some entity A is not identical to A. So if there's any possible world in which A is not identical to B, then it follows that A is not in fact identical to B. Now, since it's possible that human well-being and moral goodness are not identical, it follows necessarily that human well-being and goodness are not the same as Dr. Harris has asserted in his book. Now, it's not often in philosophy that you get a knockdown argument against a position, but I think we've got one here by granting that it's possible that the continuum of well-being is not identical to the moral landscape. Dr. Harris's view becomes logically incoherent. And all of this goes to underline my fundamental point that on atheism, there's just no reason to identify the well-being of conscious creatures with moral goodness. Atheism cannot explain the reality, the objective reality of moral values. We also looked at the is-ought distinction. 2 problems stand out. First, natural science tells us only what is, not what ought to be the case, and the ought implies can. Second problem, ought implies can. A person is not morally responsible for an action which he is unable to avoid. For example, if somebody shoves you into another person, you're not responsible for bumping into him. You had no choice. But Sam Harris believes that all of our actions are causally determined and that there is no free will. Dr. Harris rejects not only libertarian accounts of free will, but also compatibilistic accounts of freedom, to which Dr. Harris has never replied in the course of this evening's debate. In his last speech, he said, but we simply must rely upon certain axioms. Well, that's the same as saying you've got to take it by faith. And if these axioms are moral axioms, then I think he's admitting my point, that on atheism, there simply is no ground for believing the objectivity of moral values and duties. He just takes them by a leap of faith. He says, well, there are different senses of the word objective. Yes, of course, and in my opening speech, I made clear the sense in which I was defining the term. I mean valid and binding independent of human opinion. To say that moral values and duties are objective is to say that they are valid and binding independent of human opinion.